Welcome back to Eschatology Matters. Eschatology Matters is available on the Fight Laugh Feast network, and you can also find us on Boniface Media. We want to be sure to mention to you the Puritan Treasures. If you want to start reading the Puritans, but you don't know where to begin, I recommend Puritan Treasures for Today, which is a series that's available through Reformation Heritage Books. It makes the riches of these godly writers of old accessible for the modern reader. With updated language and helpful introductions, these classic works from John Owen, Jeremiah Burroughs, and others are the perfect starting point for the curious reader. Learn more about the Puritan Treasures series for today at heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. When you go there, use the code EMatters for 10% off your order. Again, that's heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. Today we're getting into our overview of approaches to the revelation. We're going to be looking at idealist, futurist, historicist, and preterist approaches. And today I'm joined by author Jay Rogers. Jay, thank you so much for chatting with me today.
I'm very honored to be here. Thank you.
Yes, sir. We're going to get into some of your works and everything, I think, toward the end of this. But the general approach for today is we wanted to look at an overview to the revelation, sort of a general overview of what the message of the revelation is communicating, and then finally wrap up with some recommended reading. So if you could just jump in, looking at hermeneutical approaches, how to read the revelation, what would be the overview of your approach to the revelation, and how would you describe that, Jay?
Okay, so just a real brief and quick summary that there mainly have been throughout history four methods of interpretation of Bible prophecy, predictive Bible prophecy. One of them would be preterism, then historicism, futurism, and idealism. So, for example, preterism would be what we would call the before times view. That would be that most of the prophecies of Daniel, the Mount Olivet Discourse, which is Matthew 24, the book of Revelation, are fulfilled by AD 70. And the big event there is the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the persecution of Christians by the Emperor Nero. And so that's one approach. The next approach is historicism. And historicism says that prophecies of Revelation are fulfilled sometime in history. It could be in the first century, but not necessarily. It could be in the future, but usually it focuses on the Middle Ages. And so you might see like the Black Plague in the Middle Ages being one of the plagues in the book of Revelation. You might see the four horsemen of the apocalypse in Revelation 6 bringing the Black Plague, or the Pope at the time of Martin Luther is often thought to be the beast. Somehow like the invasions of Islam would fill that, but they don't think that everything already happened in history. They still think that there's a future fulfillment too. So it's kind of like historicism is a grab bag, all of the above. It's ongoing. It happened in the past, it's happening now, it's happening in the future, but very specific fulfillments. Okay, then we have futurism. That's the end times view. So preterism is before times, futurism is future times. And most of the prophecies of Revelation are yet to be fulfilled. So, there's some really imaginative kind of interpretations. Like I've heard that like the locust plagues of Revelation 9 are actually like Cobra helicopters. And that the big one is that the northern invader of Ezekiel 30, when I was growing up, the big Ezekiel 38 and 39, that was the Soviet Union, or now it would be Russia or Iran or something like that. So they try to look at what's happening in the daily news and then apply that to the book of Revelation. Some people call it newspaper exegesis. Okay. And then finally, idealism is also called this. Idealism is spiritual. It's a spiritualist approach. It says that the prophecies of Revelation are not to be taken woodenly literally, but they have a general symbolic application in all of history. So you look at the heavenly battle in Revelation 12, and that would be like, this is ongoing fight between good and evil that's taking place. And it could be specific, but mainly it's general. So those are the four main approaches.
Okay. And the one you'd be presenting then is preterism. And what would distinguish preterism? Like you've already gone through it, but some of the main characteristics, maybe some of the passages or phrases or anything in scriptures that are kind of pushing you in that direction.
Okay, well, first, it's very important to understand that these are hermeneutical approaches. Like preterism isn't a doctrine. It's not like I open up a prophecy and say, it has to have happened in AD 70. And I've seen people do that. And it's kind of like, the old saying, like you give someone a hammer and everything's a nail. like everything has to be like, but I'm a postmillennialist. And so usually like postmillennialists are either idealists, like R.J. Rushdoony, who you might know is an idealist. Other postmillennialists are historicists. A lot of the reformers were historicists. And then preterist is basically saying that, well, if you look at the book of Revelation and you open it up to Revelation 1, verse 1, right, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show unto his servants the things which might shortly come to pass. And he sent and signified it by his angel unto the servant John. So when the angel is speaking, when Jesus is speaking to John through the angel, and he's saying, these are things which must shortly come to pass, John and his audience understood that it must shortly come to pass. A lot of people will pick this up and say, these are things which must shortly come to pass. It says it right here in the book of Revelation. And that's not a very good method of interpretation. You have to understand the audience, you have to understand the author. There's another line which a lot of people don't notice, but it's verse 3, and it says, "Blessed is he that reads, and they that hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things that are written therein, for the time is at hand." So they say, hear that the time is at hand. The end times are at hand. But another thing that people say is that Revelation is the only book in the Bible that contains a blessing for those who read it. But that's not actually what that verse means. I mean, it is a blessing to read the Bible, but when John wrote, "Blessed is he that readeth," he meant the elder that was going to read this book to the churches. Like, this was a letter sent to 7 churches, and John was saying, you're going to have a blessing if you read this book to the churches, and the people in the churches that hear the words of the prophecy and keep those things which are written therein are going to be blessed. Why? Because the time is at hand. And so if you get Revelation 1 through 3 right, the way that it was meant, like, what did the author mean? How would the audience have understood it? It's kind of hard to argue that an audience in the first century would have read this, an audience that is in persecution, that they would have read this and said, oh, we're in persecution now, but this has nothing to do with us. It's got to do with things that are going to happen between Israel and Iran in 2024. When I first encountered preterism, it was mainly through the works of Ken Gentry. We worked on a video presentation together in 1999, which was right before 2000. So there was a lot of like last days madness going on. So he did this presentation at R.C. Sproul's conference, and they gave different views: the premillennial view, the amillennial view, the preterist view, and so on. So Gentry gave the postmillennial view, but he spoke on preterism, like, who is the beast of Revelation? So we did a video called "The Beast of Revelation Identified." And as I was working on that video, I became more and more convinced that this makes the most sense, that Nero is this fulfillment of the beast of Revelation. But what I did was I didn't immediately go and start studying Revelation. I went back to Daniel, because I realized that, well, if John is saying this about 7 kings and a beast with 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 horns, Daniel is writing about the same thing in Daniel 7. So I remembered that I had a Bible when I was growing up, and it was actually a Catholic Bible, but it had sort of like it sort of had, most people that interpret Daniel, they understand that the first 4 kingdoms that are mentioned in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 are Babylon, and then it goes to the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and then the Roman Empire. So virtually all conservative commentators agree on that. But when they get to the 4th empire, Rome, is it Rome during the time of the apostles? Is it Rome during the time of Martin Luther and the Catholic Church? Is it Rome, like a resurrected Rome in the end times with the Antichrist and things like that? That's where there are the easy parts, the parts that everyone understands, and then the hard parts. So I really started looking at Daniel, and I said, if there's a preterist approach to Revelation, how does Daniel line up with that? So one of the most important things that you can do to understand Revelation is to understand the Old Testament first. Revelation has the most references by far of any New Testament book to the Old Testament. And the interesting thing is it never specifically literally quotes the New Testament, but it alludes to it. And so they say for every one verse in Revelation, there are at least two verses that are alluded to in the Old Testament. It's kind of crazy, but that's, if you work it out, I have that in my book. I show that, but it's like it's everything is like hyperlinked back into the Old Testament. Ezekiel is a big one, Deuteronomy is a big one, and so is Daniel. And so the strange thing about most interpreters of Revelation is what they do is they read Revelation, they try to figure out what it means, and then they will take Old Testament prophecy, and it's almost like they're retrofitting those prophecies into Revelation to make them fit their interpretation. But they should do the exact opposite of that. What they should do is they should go into Ezekiel and say, what was Ezekiel talking about? What did he think he meant? How would his audience have understood it? And so on. And then take that understanding and then bring it to Revelation. The other strange thing about interpreters is sometimes you'll get someone who will say, well, Daniel's prophecy means this. It was fulfilled preteristically in this passage. But then in the next verse, we're going to jump 2,000 years into the future, 2,500 years into the future. And then when they get to Matthew 24, many interpreters will even go back through church history. Many, many interpreters agreed that the first part of Matthew 24, like Matthew 24, 1 through 36, was about the abomination of desolation, which was the Romans sacking the temple, sacking the city of Jerusalem and raising the temple in AD 70. There was a lot of good corroboration in early centuries, all through history. That's what that was about. But then when the same commentators go to Revelation, there are parallel passages that seem almost like they're talking about the same thing. And they say, oh, no, this is about the Antichrist. So I found that very strange. And almost everybody throughout history does that. They look at Bible prophecy and they use different hermeneutical approaches, like they're a grab bag. Like we're going to use preterism here we're going to use historicism, here we're going to use futurism. I did this interesting study. There's a Spanish scholar from I think it was the 1100s, 1200s. His name was Joachim of Fiore, and he was actually the first postmillennialist. But his method of interpretation was crazy. He basically took everything that had ever been written about Revelation and he tried to synthesize it all into one package. And he had like one passage could mean like 4 different things and everything like that. So there's a lot of humor about the way that people have interpreted Revelation. There was one satirist in the 1800s. His name was Ambrose Bierce, and he said that Revelation is a book where John concealed everything he knew about Jesus Christ, and that the revealing is done by commentators who know nothing. I like that. John Calvin said that he writes. John Calvin actually has a preterist commentary on Daniel. A lot of people think that Calvin was a historicist, but Calvin never wrote a commentary on Revelation. He did write one on Daniel, which is preterist. And he'll say things like, here the commentators are utterly at sea. Some people think that the little horn is the Pope, others say the Turk, the Muslim invasions. They're all wrong. Like he basically says like everybody else is wrong. And then he gives his, it's actually very funny to read that because people get very exasperated when they see like there's so many different interpretations. Well, how do you know that you're right? That's the tough part, And like I just said, you have to go back to what does it say in the first chapter? Is this a book written to the Christians in Asia Minor in the time of John, or is it written to the Christians in the United States of America in the 21st century? And that's, you start there, and then you look at the easy parts that you can kind of see that, okay, I can see that this means this, and then you interpret the hard parts through the easy parts.
How about a general overview for what the book of the Revelation is communicating? If you were to have to give, which that's a tall task, there's a lot going on, obviously, in the Revelation. You know, you mentioned all the Old Testament tie-ins, but what's a good general overview of what the book is communicating and what it's trying to express to the believer, to the reader?
Okay, first of all, I'm of the school of thought that says that there's a lot of recapitulation in Revelation. Like it's not like a history, it's a prophecy. Daniel is very, if you understand Daniel, you understand that Daniel recapitulates. Like he gives you the history of the four kingdoms, then he gives you the four kingdoms again in more detail. Then he gives you two of the kingdoms. Then he gives you the 490-year overview of what's going to happen, and then a little bit of what happens in the fourth kingdom. And then 11 and 12 basically is, Babylon was over by that point, but it's the three kingdoms up. So there's five visions, and they all recapitulate. Each one is a little bit different, coming from a different perspective, and each one adds a little bit more information as you go. I look at Revelation, and it's almost patterned after this. So there are passages in Revelation that are definitely patterned after Daniel, like especially if you look at Daniel 7 and Revelation 13 and 17, there's a lot of similarities. So that's one thing, you would do that. I think that one of the most clear, once you get past Revelation chapter 1, which we already talked about, is these are things which are soon to come to pass. The time is at hand, and John's speaking to an audience in persecution. Once you get past that and you decide, like, well, maybe he's speaking of things that are about to come to pass. Like once you take it literally, like people say that, well, I take the book of Revelation literally. Well, literally, if you think that these are things that are about to come to pass, then let's look at a passage. Like you go to Revelation chapter 12, which is the middle of the book, and you find there's four elements in Revelation 12. You have a woman who's clothed in the sun. You have a child who's caught up to heaven. You have a dragon, which John identifies as Satan. And then you have the remnant of the woman's seed. Okay, so the dragon's easy because John actually tells us that it's Satan. Okay, so we know that. But then we have a woman who gives birth to a child. There's two views on that. The Roman Catholics have said it's Mary. And then Jews and Protestants, not Jews, but Protestants have said that this is Israel. Now, obviously, Mary was part of Israel, so you could include Mary in that. But Israel gives birth to a son. And you can think of the book of Isaiah, where the virgin shall conceive, she shall bear a son, we shall call him Emmanuel, and so on. So this is the son. And the dragon persecutes the woman and the remnant of her seed. So the remnant of her seed would be those faithful Israel, those in faithful Israel who have kept the testimony of Jesus Christ. And if you read through Revelation chapter 12, John basically says that. Then what you can do is you can compare Revelation chapter 12 to Revelation chapter 11, which is similar. And then compare Revelation chapter 12 to Revelation chapter 9, which is also similar. And so you have this template of, you have a battle going on. It's a spiritual battle. It's happening in heaven, but it's also happening on earth. And what it is that Satan is trying to destroy the remnant of God's seed. It's the remnant of the woman's seed, but it's actually the seed of the woman goes back to what story in the Bible? To Genesis, where God curses the serpent, and he says that there will be enmity between the serpent and the woman's seed. So that's what John's referring to there. So it's a battle that takes place throughout history, obviously, but in the first century there was a war, and there was a war on Judea, and there were Christians who were part of that war, but they fled the city. And so you start to see that pattern throughout the book of Revelation. And I would go very generally first, like just try to understand that that's the pattern. God allows Satan to persecute the church. Then he allows Satan to come against Jerusalem, to punish Jerusalem, those that rejected Christ, but those that kept the testimony of Christ, they're allowed to escape Jerusalem. And there are martyrs as well throughout this whole story. And without getting into like really, really specific details, first you try to understand that that's what's going on. And so John is trying to comfort Christians that are, first they've been persecuted by the Jews in Asia Minor. So it says that in the first 3 chapters. And then they're also being persecuted by the Roman authorities as well, like the civil magistrates and so on. And so he's trying to show them that, yes, there is this war going on right now. And there was literally a war taking place during this time period. There was a war that was taking place in Jerusalem, and then there was a pause, and there was a Roman civil war for a year, and the Christians in Asia Minor were in the middle of that too. Like that's something that needs a lot of development in preterist studies, but there's some good research out there about how the Roman emperors who were fighting each other during the year of the 4 emperors, which was the year 68 to 69, they were very involved in Asia Minor, where those churches were. And so John is prophesying to them, these things are shortly to come to pass. Okay, and that's the first half of the book. And I believe that the second half of the book basically says the same thing. And it leads up to there's some really specific, when you get into Revelation 18 and 19, there are really specific references to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And that goes back to Daniel and to some other Old Testament prophecies that also predict that as well as the Mount Olivet Discourse. And John was present at the Mount Olivet Discourse. I'll give you a real interesting thing about the Mount Olivet Discourse that a lot of people don't know. The Mount Olivet Discourse either took place on Wednesday or Thursday of the Holy Week. Okay, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, one of those days. And the Jewish day started at sunset, right? And Jesus stood on the Mount Olivet Discourse and spoke about the abomination of desolation. And Luke specifically interprets that as being armies surrounding Jerusalem. And then Jesus said, "This generation shall not pass away until all these things come to pass." Exactly 40 years later, on Holy Week, which is Passover week, on that exact day, like 3 days before Passover, Titus's army surrounded Jerusalem. And so it's kind of interesting. And where did they set up camp? Do you know where they set up camp? They set up camp on Mount Olivet. And from the top of Mount Olivet, you could see down into the temple, like you could see into the temple courts from that point. So you have Jesus looking down into the temple courts and prophesying destruction. And then exactly 4 years later, you have the armies, the abomination with their Roman pagan symbols and so on, and they're about to start this 6-month siege of Jerusalem. So I find those kind of things very compelling, and I think that a lot of Revelation actually specifically refers to some of those events.
So just by way of clarification, so you're taking an early date, or what they would refer to as an early date, on the writing of the book of the Revelation, right?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I think that Revelation could not have been written later than December of AD 64. And the reason why I think that is because there was a fire in Rome in the summer of AD 64. And what happened was, very soon after the fire, 1/3 of the city burned, and Nero started clearing the land that was around the capital. And he started building this golden palace, this golden house. He also eventually erected a statue of himself that was 100 feet high. It was covered in gold, this whole thing. And rumors started, according to Tacitus and also Suetonius, who are Roman historians, that Nero himself started the fire because he wanted to clear the land. And he may have, he may not have. It's one of those things, historians don't agree on that. But he may not have started the fire, but the rumor started that he started the fire. And so he looked for a scapegoat, and very quickly he found Christians. Okay. And we know that Christians in Rome then started to become, spectacles. They started lighting them on fire, feeding them to animals and things like that. And basically, Nero brought them into the place that he was building for his palace to do that. John was in Asia Minor, so it's somewhat of a distance away. But my idea is that John was probably arrested too and sent to Patmos. And Patmos was kind of like a penal colony, and it could have been like there's no historical record of how he got to Patmos. We just know he was on Patmos. Okay, so there's some interesting things in the Book of Revelation where there's one point in the Book of Revelation at the end of chapter 11 where he said, "And I stood on the sand of the sea," you know, and the sandy shores of Patmos would have been facing toward Rome, and then the next chapter is Revelation chapter 12 and so on. So there's some really interesting things in there about that. The reason why I say December 64 is because there's a tribulation that happens where this beast persecutes Christians, and it's for 3.5 years. And so we know that Nero died on June 10th. Is it June 10th or June 11th of AD 68? So if you count 3.5 years from December until June AD 68, that's the right time period, and it fits the historical record because the fire took place in the summer. The persecution of the Christians started after that. There's another historical marker in the same chapter in Tacitus, which is the spring, and this is like the persecution of the Christians is kind of like in the middle of that. So it had to have been in the fall. And then that kind of gives you enough time to have John arrested as well. So John, if this is about Nero, and John is actually prophesying about the persecution of Christians during the time of Nero, it can't be after the persecution of the Christians by Nero, because that's not a prophecy, right? But if he was prophesying like November, December, that time, then that would make sense because it's exactly 3.5 years that the persecution took place. And so I was saying earlier that one of the things that we need to do is we need to let Scripture interpret Scripture. So if you have a good template for Revelation chapter 12, I happen to think Revelation chapter 12 is not easy, but it's not one of the most difficult passages in Revelation. If you get down to like the great red dragon is Satan, he's red because he's full of fury. He viciously desires the blood of the saints. That's very straightforward. But what's confusing is the 7 heads and 10 horns in the same image, because it's the same image seen in Revelation 13 and 17. Now we know that Revelation 12 is Satan, but then preterists will say, well, Revelation 13, the dragon is Rome. So what is it? Is the dragon Satan or is it Rome? Well, in Revelation 13, we see it's a sea beast. It doesn't specifically say it's a dragon, but he gets his power from the dragon. You see? So what John is trying to say there is that this persecution that you're experiencing is coming from the devil, Satan, but Satan is using Rome to persecute the saints. So it's kind of giving, this is what apocalyptic literature does. Apocalyptic literature is not necessarily about the future. Like we say, it's apocalyptic. Apocalyptic means a revealing. John is revealing to the church, this is the reason why you're in persecution. This is what's behind it. I don't know if you've ever been, felt like you were under spiritual oppression or spiritual attack before. But if you have, sometimes it's comforting to know this is the devil. This is just a spiritual attack, because then you know that God is in control. So that's just what John is trying to do. It's actually a very pastoral message. So we see that the great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. All right, that's Revelation chapter 12, verse 3. So later on, we see a recapitulation of the same image in Revelation 17. John says the beast gets his power from the dragon. That's 17:10. The dragon is Satan, but the sea beast is Rome. The heads and the horns symbolize the line of the Roman emperors who began to act as Satan's proxy. So it's like a proxy war. Hear about proxy wars. This is Satan's proxy war using Rome. He's going after the church, but not doing it directly because he can't, but he's allowed to use Nero. Okay? Nero is the 6th king who is in Revelation 13:10. And then at the time of John's writing, the 6th king who is Nero. So he began the war against Judea in AD 66. and that eventually resulted in the destruction of the temple after Nero's death in AD 70.
Okay, so thinking along these lines, then, if somebody's trying to grasp the revelation, specifically maybe from those taking a preterist approach, where would you direct them? What sort of reading can they start to get into? Historical figures? Just where would you put some mile markers that people can be directed with?
Yeah, just real briefly, I want to use the term preterist postmillennialism because it's in the framework of postmill. There are some preterists, believe it or not, there are premillennialists that take a preteristic approach to some passages, like especially Matthew 24 and Daniel and things like that. There are a lot of amillennialists too, but preterist postmillennialism is very important. To get a good postmillennialist view, I recommend a book, very short book. It's by John Jefferson Davis, and it's called Christ's Victorious Kingdom. And then the subtitle is Postmillennialism Reconsidered. He was a scholar at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and he himself came to a postmill view by looking at the fact that there were these great 19th century missionaries and social reformers, revivalists, and almost to a man, they were postmillennialists. And he thought that was odd. And he started looking at the reason why. And in the process, he too became a postmillennialist, which is kind of interesting. The second book that I read was actually by David Chilton, and it's called Paradise Restored. That's good for hermeneutics, like how do you interpret the Bible? I also think David Chilton's book on Days of Vengeance, which is his verse-by-verse commentary on Revelation. Kenneth Gentry has like a 2,000-page, I think it is, commentary on Revelation that just came out, and I haven't bought it because it's over $100, and I don't want to ask him just to send it to me, but I'm going to get that eventually. Ken Gentry and I actually together, we edited this book, and it's called The Apocalypse of John by Milton S. Terry. So I don't agree with everything in this book, like every detail of it, but this is a good methodological way of approaching Revelation. He doesn't really get down into the weeds and overinterpret Revelation, but he gives generally, this is a preteristic approach. He did a very good book called Biblical Hermeneutics. There was a 3-part series. One of them was Biblical Hermeneutics. Another one was called Biblical Apocalyptics. And he went through every single apocalyptic book in the Bible, including some of the what they call pseudepigraphal books, like the Book of Baruch and so on. And he basically showed how to interpret those books. So this is very good. And we just took the part, some of his biblical apocalyptics book I really disagree with, like the parts on Daniel, for instance. But this is fairly good. So what we did was we just took the part on Revelation and we published this as a fairly short book. And you can get this on Amazon. Let's see, who else? I can recommend my books, of course. This is kind of a fun one. This is called Nero Caesar, the Sixth Head of the Beast. And it just deals with the question of, is Nero actually the beast of Revelation? And I have some things in here that no one else has. Like I came across things that, as far as I know, I'm the only one that's ever really discovered this. There is, for instance, one of the things that you find people say about one of the criticisms of preterism is that code of 666 equals the beast, right? Where you add up the name of Nero in Hebrew, Neron Kaiser in Hebrew, that adds up to the number 666. One of the criticisms was that no one in history ever thought of that until the 1800s. But I actually went back into some older books, and I found this is on page. Actually, this book doesn't have page numbers, so because it's more of like a graphics thing. But I actually went back into some older books, and I found that in the year 1646, there was a French writer who said that we also see the name of Neron Kaiser according to the calculation of Hebrew letters, which we find the famous number of 666. So that's quite a bit older than the 1800s. Then there's another one from 1654 where it says, indeed, the Hebrew letters for Neron and Kaiser make up the same number of 666. So I found these on Google Books. These are out of print, old French books. And like the saying goes, where there's smoke, there's fire. They didn't come up with that. They heard it from somewhere else. So this has been an idea that's been around. It's not just in the past 150 years people came up with this. It's something that people have known about for a while. And we have only like some books by some Christian authors that still exist. So there's another guy, Revelation and the First Century, Francis X. Gummerlock. He started a project back in the early 2000s. He said there are about 26 books. I don't know the exact number, but it's like 24 books that were written up until the High Middle Ages on, prior to the printing press, that were on the Book of Revelation. There aren't really that many full commentaries on the Book of Revelation in the first 1,000 years of the church. People find that interesting, but I think he went up to the year about maybe 1300, and he listed it, but he said most of these books have never been translated into English. They're in Latin and Greek, but you have to be a Latin and Greek scholar to read them. So he started a project to get them all into English, and he found out that there were quite a few writers that did have preterist interpretations of prophecy. And like I said before, they kind of treated it like a grab bag. Like in this chapter, the red horse is Nero, but then later on it's, they get into a futuristic thing. But the fact of the matter is people have had this idea for a long time. Preterism is not new. Preterism has only been really systematized like probably in the last 200 years. Actually, I shouldn't say that. Preterism was systematized in the 1600s, like during these books at that time. But up until that time, we didn't really have the historical grammatical method either.
Right.
Like a lot of the interpretations in the Middle Ages were very allegorical. And that's the reason why it seems so crazy. It's kind of like they pull one thing from here, one thing from another. I told you about Joachim of Fiore. I like Joachim of Fiore, but you can't read him in English because it's all in Latin. So I can read like little translations of things that he said from papers and things like that. But so you have to kind of pick a way to interpret Revelation. I would recommend looking into the preterist view and getting some of these books and seeing if it's something that you agree with. And, like I always tell people, don't take my word for it. Be like the wise Bereans, go into the Bible, see if these things are true, read other authors, and, prayerfully decide for yourself.
Seated here at my right hand, the